Hello, everyone. My name is Jayan Sriram, and I'm your host for today. Welcome to another interesting episode of the CII podcast. Recent developments in the global arena have accentuated the vulnerabilities of supply chains and highlighted the imperative for a smooth and efficient flow of goods and services that is impervious to localized disruptions. Keeping trade open across borders and establishing coordinated mechanisms for risk monitoring and crisis foresight is crucial to preventing future roadblocks and ensuring that the development trajectories of economies don't get affected. As India holds the G20 presidency, what are the priorities that it is focusing on to build resilience to unexpected choke points in supply chains? How is the Business 20 Engagement Group working under the B20 India process to develop solutions for Trade 4.0 and inclusive growth? What is the role of India in world trade? Let's find out today in discussion with Fernando Landa, President, Argentina Chamber of Exporters. Mr. Landa has a 40-year industrial experience with a tech-end group of companies, having led in many instances its process of internationalization. As co-chair of the B20 India Task Force on Inclusive GBCs for Resilient Global Trade and Investment, Mr. Landa has been actively engaged in the B20 India process and has shared many valuable ideas for strengthening and enhancing global value chains. Thanks for making the time for us today, Mr. Landa, and thank you for joining us on the CII podcast.
Thank you very much, Jans. Thank you for the invitation. Jan.
Right. So if I may start with a broad question, COVID-19 has reignited an old argument about the supply chain risks associated with international production. How do you think that countries have succeeded in getting appropriate value chains which are ensuring better availability of critical resources?
Sure. I mean, at this point, COVID-19 seems a long way ago, since many things have passed over these past few years. But COVID-19 implied major and unexpected disruptions for CBGs. And as countries prioritize their need for consistent and secure supply chains, the notions of nearshoring, reshoring gain strength. And this persisted even after the global economy was back on track. Now, recent geopolitical events have stifled any chance of reversal or short-term reversal of this trend. So strategic tensions between major powers and armed conflicts have exacerbated uncertainties. And now countries are focusing on de-risking. This is the new key word, de-risking their economic relationships. In fact, there is a very interesting recent IMF study that analyzed the impact of geopolitical fragmentations on FDI flows. And it shows that over the last decade, the share of FDI flows among geopolitically aligned countries has risen more than those FDI flows between geographically close countries. So critical resources are, of course, the major concern driven this trend and are drivers for trade shifts. So in this context, building trust and CBG resilience, which is the key word for our working group, is of paramount importance, and it requires coordinated efforts from both governments and the private sector. The main question here is what can be done. For starters, I think logistics has an important role to play because it can function as an enabler of resilience, of reliability, of efficiency. And therefore, it is critical to advance, and this is a message for G20 countries as well as developing countries, is a critical to advance investments in multimodal logistics infrastructure, including transport corridors, ports, railways, and handling equipment. All these have the potential to increase, to advance attractiveness and resilience in value chains. Similarly, streaming procedures related to imports and exports is crucial to create a business-friendly environment and attracting FDI flows. These are two key elements that should be part of any holistic approach for increasing trade participation for developing countries. To this end, the B20 is looking forward to the publication of the World Bank Business Environment Index, which will allow again for countries to benchmark their performance. This is very, very important, particularly for those countries that are lagging behind. Another B20 recommendation is implementing technology-enabled mechanisms for early detection and mitigation of potential trade crises. Having an early understanding of the level of exposure and vulnerabilities can be, of course, invaluable in the developing of informed resilience strategies. One way of doing this is by monitoring shipping bottlenecks. And in these aspects, we have seen, of course, the crisis derived in COVID-19 precisely from port congestion and logistical disruption. So in this particular point, maritime bodies information availability made by key partners is crucial. Sharing this information will improve supply chain reliability, reduce exposure to risk, and keep operations running smoothly. We also think that a key consensus priority should be enhancing preparedness. We had an expected crisis, but it is foreseeable that eventually we may have another, and ensuring the flow of critical goods such as medicines and vaccines with a special emphasis on food security is also a key factor that should be considered.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I think it was very broad-ranging. It really highlighted a lot of issues. I'd like to expand the discussion and ask you if you could share your views with us on the role of FDI flows in green, sustainable, and circular business models, and how that plays a role in strengthening GBCs.
Of course. Well, governments around the world, this is a very, very interesting item that we should take into account. Governments around the world are stepping up their efforts to develop regulatory frameworks for sustainable finance and investments. Now, it is important to note that currently available instruments are mostly skewed towards developed countries, and in particular AU. So we need to consider that developed nations have also an unmatched capacity to provide incentives for green transition that developing economies are lacking. Most developing economies are facing this immense challenge with limited resources, and in many cases have high post-pandemic debt. So FDI flows and increasing the national investment can provide these resources and expertise to scale up sustainable and circular business models. Now, what we at the B20 advocate is that the G20 should emphasize the need for an aligned FDI definition. This will provide needed coherence and help compliance, as well as facilitate to incentivize investment across borders. Now, the urgent question is, okay, fine, how do we scale up these flows? And here, the role of developing finance institutions and multilateral development banks is crucial. They can facilitate projects by sharing in blended finance structures that use public capital to catalyze private flows. So I think that could be the broad answer to your question.
All right, that's very interesting again. And, it's interesting that you mentioned the standardized definition of FDI. I want to ask you, do you think India's focus on mutual recognition agreements and increased participation in RTAs will help the country to strengthen its operational resiliency when it comes to GBCs?
Well, let me start by saying that not having mutual recognition agreements and interoperability, and instead having divergent rules between countries create additional costs that can be very hard for MSMEs and developing countries to manage. And these have a direct impact on inclusivity. So one important India message here, B20 India message here, is to call upon G20 nations to establish mutual recognition agreements for certifications and standards to increase interoperability. Now, this of course is a trade facilitation point, a trade facilitation agreement point, but I think we have to foster these mutual recognition agreements. B20 India is also calling for the G20 to assist developing nations through best practices and frameworks to facilitate access, specifically for economies that are lagging behind in trade engagement. Now, bringing developing nations to the global stage through inclusive standards and programs can only occur if mutual recognitions of AGOs and similar certifications exist in a wider forum. Coming to India, India in particular has signed 13 RTAs and FTAs to foster a vision of growth through international trade. And I think I could not give an opinion on the specifics of India, but I think the key takeaway for other developing nations here is to focus on complementarity, on the ability to capture FDI flows and increasing the economic complexity of their matrix of exports, which is something that, for example, in Argentina is a key issue, a key driver that should be considered for the near future. So I think there are many takeaways from the Indian experience for us.
Okay, and I want to move now to the question of ESG standards, and to ask you, can India move toward resilient global value chains by focusing on a globally aligned approach to ESG standards, and recognize the differential development status of different nations in doing so?
Well, ESG standards are important from first for investor point of view, because of many factors, such as risk management on their investments, attractiveness, long-term sustainability, compliance. So it is, however, important to keep in mind that there are, as we discovered in our evaluation in B20, that there are roughly 600 different ESG approaches that are being used today, which each nation having multiple standards and diverse areas of emphasis and new concepts that are ever evolving. Now, this complicates the selection of standards and reporting for larger firms, creates highest levels of effort, increases compliance costs. And this is a barrier of entry. It creates challenges for MSMEs and developing countries seeking to participate in CBGs. So an aligned approach, having a recognition of differential national treatment status, would enable CBGs to account for their environmental, social, and governance impact fairly and truly. This aligned approach should be easier for small companies and developing countries to participate. We see that this is very, very difficult for MSMEs in particular. With increased interest from investors and climate stakeholders alike, the B20 India is calling for the G20 to recommend that all member nations should work towards aligning a common approach and a comprehensive ESG framework. If we want to generate a positive environmental outcome, and in doing that, it is important also to give a true weightage to differential economic status of economies. One important B20 message here is to ensure carbon tracking is in place. And when discussing carbon border adjustment measures, they are implemented in such a manner that is, first of all, multilaterally compliant, and fair to nations, keeping in mind this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, as mentioned in the Paris Agreement. In some instances, some of these products have international bodies or sectoral bodies have already discussed how to measure the carbon footprint. So it is important that we build upon what's already been done and not create new standards. So additionally, B20 recommends that all member nations and businesses follow, of course, critical business practices that promote fairness, transparency, equality, such as adopting responsible, gender-neutral and non-discriminatory practices, respecting human rights, having zero tolerance for corruption. We've done a lot in the B20 over the past years in several compliance and anti-corruption discussions. And I think this should also be taken into account. It is important to push, to fight corruption is one of the major drivers for development. So I think this would be my answer to your question.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned MSMEs in your last answer. And as we round out the discussion today, I want to circle back to that. Nearly 50% of India's exports come from the small and medium enterprise sector. And what measures and policies would you think are to be adopted to promote MSMEs to ensure that they are integrated into regional production networks?
Very interesting that you mentioned this. In our case, it is not so. I mean, we don't have that many. We have a lot of MSMEs participating in the international trade, but they don't have that weight in total exports, and this is a major problem. Why? Because one key factor to consider in pondering this issue is that MSMEs are the main source of employment, particularly in developing countries. This is true for all, but in particular for developing countries. So providing integration opportunities is the best way to promote inclusion and development. In fact, our motto is that exports provide these drivers. So when we at the B20, we make proposals to the G20 leaders on policy actions. We are not looking only at multilateral implementation, let's say. In fact, we are looking for both multilateral actions and policies, as well as national implemented policies that are meant to be the result of recent consensus and result from best practices. So this is an important. In fact, in some instances, we've measured how do we implement the recommendations B20s are suggested, and in some cases, national implementation accounts for 60%, 70% of all the recommendations. That is why, in this respect, B20 is calling for first transformational opportunities for MSMEs and CBG participation through mentoring, strategic partnerships, and investments. For economies lagging in international integration, having competitiveness at the major component of a national policy is of utmost importance. I mean, G20s can cooperate with this positive benchmarking, as well with technical and financial assistance. A supportive international framework can also facilitate trade uptake in developing countries, such as the GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences, and other preferential agreements that help developing countries increase their participation in trade. Regional cooperation, including trade integration and leading to regional trade agreements and free trade agreements, can facilitate integration into the global trading system by increasing the size of accessible bodies and also by improving competitiveness and connectivity. This is why B20 advocates for promoting diversification of developing, at least developing economies, to make full use of this deepened regional integration. In our chamber think tank, we do measure the MSMEs activities, export activities, and it is clear that their exports are mostly regional. So, so this is a clear message. G20 nations can also enable environments for multilateral cooperation with the smaller businesses and value chain partners from marginalized groups. And the other thing that we may consider in your answer, in answering your question, is okay, what are the issues that account for improving MSMEs participation other than the agreements themselves? And this is, for example, digital infrastructure. Digital infrastructure has a key component of trade infrastructure nowadays. And in developing nations, this could be a serious entry barrier. So the B20 here urges G20 nations to facilitate infrastructure investments in, especially in the digital sector, for those, particularly for those more challenged economies. The G20 could also share risk to support trade finance, particularly among export credit agencies, multilateral development banks, and private sector banks, and scale up development bank schemes to countries that need it the most. An inclusive, and probably there is a link with the prior question. I mean, an inclusive and mutually recognized standard regimes can make it easier for marginalized groups and businesses in LDCs to gain access to the export market. We mentioned the trade facilitation, and we may mention the Authorized Economic Operator Program, which aims to ease processes to get these certificated operators through accelerated treatment, and reducing verifications in meetings and procedural requirements. This could go a long way to achieving inclusion goals. So it should be viewed as an inclusion goal. So we do promote mutual recognition as a major mechanism for inclusion. And last but not least, digital literacy. I mean, this is another issue that has been discussed at length in B20 proceedings in India and before India. This is a set of skills that we are required to process information, to participate in the creation of knowledge, and computing know-how, which are generally improves employability. Now, a global standard for measuring meaningful digital literacy for trade is yet to be aligned. And G20 could help in establishing this measure of digital literacy that can be implemented globally, I mean, at the national level, especially across low and middle income countries in an affordable manner. So clearing this up goes a long way. So to ensure also to ensure that the reporting on digital literacy and that gaps are identified and are used to inform what are the priority areas for policy making. So again, the sector, the MSME sector, do need to have a special focus when discussing regional trade agreements.
Thank you once again. And on that very interesting note, Mr. Landa, thank you so much for joining us on the CII podcast, sharing your views, sharing your advice, and the deliberations that are ongoing now as part of this year's B20. And thank you for making time for us.
Thank you very much.